Visionaries like Bill Gates and Steve Jobs. This morning, Elizabeth Holmes is part of the new Time 100 list just out. Her mission is to allow blood testing in every drugstore at a fraction of Medicare costs. Her innovation has fueled anticipation in the healthcare industry and made Holmes the world's youngest female self-made billionaire.
Out there in radio land, and guys, gals, non-binary pals, everyone, welcome to episode 2 of the Nice Ladies podcast. And today we are going to be discussing maybe not such a nice lady. It is one of, I think, the most interesting, insane stories of the past 10 years at least, and that is the curious case of Elizabeth Holmes, who I don't know how many people will be familiar with her. Certainly most of the Americans, I think, will be familiar with her because she is an American and she's an American entrepreneur. So if you've never heard of her before, definitely strap in, because this is a crazy story and I just think it's so interesting, and there's also, you know, a lot to learn about due diligence and checking into things from this story. So without further ado, let's just get right into Elizabeth Holmes and her company Theranos. So just for a little bit of background, Elizabeth was born in 1984, and her dad actually worked at Enron, which that should have been a flag. Not saying everyone who worked at Enron, you know, is a terrible person, but just thought it was kind of funny. And she was actually really exceptional at Mandarin, and she got into a college program while she was still in high school. And that was one of the things that really helped her get into Stanford University, which, you know, as most people know, is one of the best universities in the US. And she went in to do engineering. And when she dropped out, she started her company, and she basically poached the head of the science department, Channing Roberts, to go and work for her. And that was one of the key things that Elizabeth always surrounded herself with, very powerful and influential men. So that in itself, that she had Channing Roberts, kind of gave her a lot of credibility that she probably, you know, wouldn't have gotten otherwise. And she also, you know, moved in these circles of the middle upper class. She came from a family of entrepreneurs, and there was some doctors in her family. So moving around in those circles, you know, and going to a school like Stanford, and she went to a private school when she was younger, you know, you're mixing and meeting a lot of wealthy people. And a lot of her startup money came from her friends' parents. And, you know, we always talk about how private schools and public schools and how that affects you, and, you know, the education is one thing, but those social connections and other things that people don't really talk about, like when you look at these people who set up these startups and they go on to make tons and tons of money, being able to do that is a class thing in itself, because some people would never be able to take the risk of opening their own business because they're living paycheck to paycheck. And you have people like Mark Zuckerberg and Jeff Bezos, and they're some of the richest people on the planet. But, you know, Jeff Bezos got like $120,000 to start Amazon from his parents. So I'm sure there's a lot of people out there that if they were given $120,000, okay, maybe they couldn't start Amazon, but they could start a successful business. So keep in mind as we're moving through the story, like, and notice a lot of the names that Elizabeth is always kind of surrounding herself with money, power, and influence. So for this podcast, I have done more research than I usually do for this sort of thing, for my normal videos on YouTube. And I watched the documentary The Inventor, which I've actually seen it a couple of times now. It's very good. If you enjoy this podcast or you just want to know more about Elizabeth Holmes and Theranos, I highly suggest it. I read the book, Bad Blood, and I watched countless YouTube videos and read countless articles. And in the documentary, The Inventor, they speak with a professor of medicine at Stanford, and it's someone that Elizabeth approached in, when she was a student in the early days. And in the beginning, she was asking to create basically a patch that you would attach, and the patch would be like a microchip that would be able to tell, oh, hey, you have an infection and you need antibiotics, and then you would be able to deliver the antibiotics through the patch. And this professor is saying, I told Elizabeth this will never work. And the reason that things like this wouldn't work is because antibiotics aren't potent. There's a reason that you have a big, bag hanging on an IV. Like it's just not scientifically possible. It's like someone asking for an explanation why, time travel doesn't exist. There's no, we can imagine this idea, but an idea, it's not an invention. So I did think that was like an interesting thing, that even in the beginning she was being told these things are not possible, like physically, scientifically, not possible. So as Elizabeth starts her company, basically over the next 10 years, like this wasn't, a 2-year company, over 10 years, she raised over $400 million in venture capital. The people that invested in her were like the Walmart family, the Waltons. Rupert Murdoch put $150 million into her, Betsy DeVos. Her board was filled with people like George Schultz, Henry Kissinger, General Mathis, tons of really influential people. So she had a lot of money, she had a lot of influence. So let's talk a little bit about what she was actually doing at this company. And the company, as I said, was called Theranos. It's supposed to be a combination of therapy and diagnosis. And if you haven't heard of Elizabeth Holmes, anybody watching this on video, I'll put it on the screen. And if you're listening on a podcast, I'll put a link in the show description so you can see the pictures. And Elizabeth's really famous thing, like when anybody pictures her in their head, I'm sure a lot of people would picture this, and she's a tall, skinny blonde woman that wears a black turtleneck because she's, thinks she's the next Steve Jobs, and literally thinks she's the next Steve Jobs. And she would always be holding this tiny, tiny vial filled with a drop of blood. And the whole premise of Theranos was, you do not need to have a tourniquet and a needle and fill vials and vials of blood, that we can do all the testing through one drop, and all the testing can be done on these small machines that were called, in the early days, Edison's, and later mini labs. And the machines are about the size of 2 like desktop computers stuck together. They look like a big printer. And the whole thing was, you just get a little prick on your finger, you fill the little vial with 1 drop of blood, you put it in the machine, and the machine does its work and then spits out your results instantaneously. And her whole vision for the future was that, like Apple, people would have these devices in their homes, and that these devices would be in every home in America, in the world, and this was the future of healthcare. So while she's building these machines, designing them, like she incorporates a lot of, Apple, like they had to have a touch screen, they had to look like the iMac. She actually went and hired the marketing team that worked with Apple. She went and hired a lot of former Apple employees and had them, designing the machine and the whole marketing strategy around it. In 2013, she actually struck a deal with Walgreens to have wellness centers, Theranos wellness centers in the Walgreens all across America. Walgreens spent $350 million redoing their stores for these wellness centers, and by this stage Elizabeth had like 800 employees. She was set up in former Facebook offices. The company was being valued at over $9 billion with a B dollars, and she owned 50% of this. So that put her net worth at $4.5 billion. And in 2015, Elizabeth Holmes was declared the youngest and wealthiest self-made female billionaire. So this all sounds great, right? Like, women in tech, women entrepreneur doing it, like, this is fantastic. But the problem is that the vial, the little drop of blood, and the Theranos mini labs, and all this, the future of healthcare, none of it actually worked. And by June 2018, her company was worth less than zero. She was banned from serving as a company officer or director for the next 10 years. And she was indicted on 9 counts of wire fraud and 2 counts of conspiracy to commit wire fraud. So things took a turn. And how do you go from a $9.5 billion company and being the wealthiest self-made female billionaire? How do you go to basically looking at facing 20 years in prison? So let's go back and look at how Elizabeth went from one extreme to another. Over the 10 years, that the company was operating, she's growing the company, bringing in more money, more employees. She's getting support from former President Obama, Bill and Hillary Clinton. Joe Biden actually went and visited the lab at Theranos and declared it like the future of healthcare. So she was absolutely fooling everyone. So as I said before, the whole premise of the company was reinventing healthcare, making it more accessible. They even at one stage changed the law in Arizona so that people could order their own blood tests, that it didn't have to go through a physician prescription. And this is all well and good, but the problem is with blood tests, with any type of testing, like, you can't just look at one test. And if you're not, a nurse or a doctor or someone who understands that stuff, it can get really messy, and people go on the computer and all of a sudden think that they have cancer, and it gets a mess. There's not really any reason that a patient would need to order their own labs. So that whole thing just creates more mess than good, to be honest. So the little finger stick vial drop of blood was using about 100th to 1000th of the blood that you would usually have in one of the big test tubes that, I'm sure we all know when you've gone to get a blood test. So the same amounts of tests being performed on one tiny drop of blood, they had to dilute the sample because they were having to make it a bigger sample to be able to test it for all of the tests. I mean, there was over 4,000 tests at one stage she was claiming that could be done. And there's been a number of Theranos employees that came out. I mean, this is how this whole thing was exposed, was through these whistleblowers and all these people who clearly were like, this is wrong. And, you know, major kudos to them, because when they spoke out, Elizabeth like just wasn't successful. Like, she had all of these extremely powerful people surrounding her. She was on the cover of every magazine. She was doing TED Talks. She was being inducted into the Harvard Fellows. Like, it was just, she had so much publicity and so much amazing publicity that a lot of the people that spoke out were very, very young people in the beginning of their career, and it could have completely destroyed them. So really huge amount of respect to Erica Chung and Tyler Schultz, who's actually George Schultz's grandson, for speaking out. And they appear in the documentary that I was speaking about before. So Erica Chung and Tyler Schultz explained that, you know, these results that were coming back were just an absolute disaster. Like, they were not right. The machines could not be calibrated. Like, you would get data set points all over the place. Like, nothing made sense. So they clearly realized, like, these machines are not working. So then what they did was they bought the commercial machines that other labs like LabCorp and Quest use, and they were taking the finger stick blood and using it in these regular machines that should be used for the big test tubes. And then they realized this isn't working either. So all these places at this stage, Walgreens, over 40 of them in Arizona, had these little Theranos wellness centers. And people, when they would go in, they would be told, oh, sorry, no, you can't have the finger stick. Your labs are special and we need to do a regular venipuncture. So people were kind of like, well, why am I here then? Because I'm here for the finger stick. So this, you know, people started getting annoyed. That started making noise that was being done. And from basically Erica Chung and Tyler Schultz coming out, there was a reporter at the Wall Street Journal whose name is John Carreyrou, and he started speaking to Erica Chung and Tyler Schultz and some other former employees. He really, really like dug deep, found everything out, all of this mess. He had sources at like lab companies and some of the regulatory bodies, and it just did not make sense. So he even went to Arizona and tried, you know, to get the finger stick, and he was met with this, no, you need a venipuncture. And he wrote an article that absolutely exposed all of this and the whole mess. And in October 2015, John Carreyrou published the article at the Wall Street Journal, and it just exploded. More former employees started coming out and speaking, and, you know, Theranos was exposed for the enormous fraud that it was. So even when this happened, when this article came out, and Elizabeth just completely basically ignored it, and when she was being inducted into the Harvard Fellows that day, she just went there like it was normal. And she went on the television show Mad Money and basically said, I'm trying to change the world here, so of course people are going to be against me because, you know, other people are trying to make money in this lab business, and I'm so wonderful and noble, my technology works, you know, blah, 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 blah. And at this stage, there's lawyers involved, like David Boyce, who is one of the most well-known lawyers in America. I mean, he's fallen on some good and bad sides of things. Like, he championed gay marriage, but he also is the lawyer who represented and tried to silence the women abused by Harvey Weinstein, and he was his lawyer. So David Boyce, was in there threatening people and saying, you basically you can't even see the machine, you can't have access to the data, you can't know that it works. Like, we're telling you that it works, but no one had ever seen it work. So it was clear at this stage that Theranos was just a mirage and was not what it said it was. And Elizabeth was just a huge fraud. So over the next few years, things just go from bad to worse. And in 2018, the US Securities and Exchange Commission charged Theranos and Elizabeth Holmes with deceiving investors by mass fraud through false or exaggerated claims above the accuracy of the company's blood testing technology. Elizabeth settled charges by paying $500,000 in fines, returning 18.9 million shares, relinquishing her voting control, and being banned from serving as an officer or a director of a company for the next 10 years. In June 2018, the federal grand jury indicted Holmes and Sonny, who is her boyfriend, was her boyfriend at the time in Theranos, a significantly older man who made a lot of money during the tech boom in Silicon Valley in the late 90s, early 2000s. And Sonny was kind of like her enforcer. He was the president as well. And you'll notice with all these people who were very highly involved, none of them had any sort of medical background, which I don't understand how people didn't see that as a flag. And the fact that Elizabeth, who dropped out of Stanford at 19, she basically had no medical background either. I mean, there's a reason that most people who win Nobel Prizes or who invent things or make vaccinations, they're, significantly older, because usually it takes a lifetime of knowledge to be able to change things. And I mean, medicine, you can't really apply the same lens as you can with something like Facebook or Uber or these tech movements, because medicine, you can teach yourself to code, or you can teach yourself about technology or about these ideas for a ride sharing app or food delivery, but you can't really teach yourself medicine. Doctors go through a formal training for a reason, and it just was really strange to me that nobody was why is there no one medical involved? Even people who worked at the company, they had a dermatologist who was the head of the lab, and a lot of the people didn't have any experience, including Elizabeth herself, who dropped out of Stanford at 19. Did they really think that a 19-year-old who dropped out her second year in college, 3 semesters under her belt, is really capable of creating technology that would transform the medical field forever, that other people hadn't been able to accomplish? So when Elizabeth and Sonny, they were indicted on 9 counts of wire fraud and 2 counts of conspiracy to commit wire fraud. This was for obviously distributing blood tests with falsified results to consumers. And Elizabeth and Sonny still haven't gone to trial. They actually were supposed to last year, but it was pushed 4 times because of COVID. And then they were about to start the trial really soon in June 2021. And then, surprise, Elizabeth's pregnant. So now they've pushed the trial until August 2021. So we shall have to do a follow-up to this one when the verdict comes out. It will be interesting for sure. At the moment, she's trying to shield like her CEO lifestyle and like the money she was spending basically from the jury. So it will be interesting to see how the trial goes. But let's talk a little bit more about what happened here, how it happened, and what sort of a person we think Elizabeth Holmes is. I mean, as I said a few minutes ago, I think it's really strange that no one from the medical community was surprised as to what claims they were making. I mean, when I was in university, I worked in a blood testing lab, and I drew the blood. We had like a small lab in the back that we ran like very basic stuff, and it's a very complicated thing. And even, I mean, when you draw blood, like I'm sure most people know that like the tubes are all different colors, like those are for reasons. They have anticoagulants in them or blockers, and to be able to run samples, like I know when I would draw someone's blood, if you know that a child or someone who has weak veins, or a lot of the time what happens is you'll get like a good draw in the beginning and they'll like be pushing out a decent amount of blood and then it'll just stop like that. And I would know like by holding up the tube, oh, I think I have enough that I can get, you know, the 4 tests that I need out of this vial. But you really couldn't just get away. Like the tube would always have to be like at least 3/4 full. You couldn't just send, and I mean a lot of the time if it was a more complicated test, we'd have to send it to like a bigger lab like Quest or LabCorp, and you couldn't just have like, you know, a little bit in the bottom, because they can't just, I mean, diluting it is gonna invalidate the results. So I just don't know how they thought she was doing this, because I know, you know, when you dig into this whole thing a lot more, there are people that had started to raise concerns and people who spoke to John Carreyrou about it, because it's impossible. Like what she is claiming is, if I sat here and said, okay, so I have an idea about time travel and I've made this magic box that makes time travel possible, but I'm not going to explain anything more about it, and you can't ask me because that's a secret, and then if I tell you, other people are going to know how to do it. So there was a lot of other things that she did to kind of cover up what she was doing. It is really interesting when you look into how long she was able to keep this ruse going, and a lot of it was contingent on her keeping this kind of highly powerful, you know, board around her and all the Apple people. So she was keeping all this like political protection around her, basically, where she thought that the authorities wouldn't touch her if she had this sort of company that she kept. And obviously it all caught up to her in the end. I mean, Erica Chung, Tyler Schultz, and John Carreyrou, who was the reporter from the Wall Street Journal who kind of exposed her, should be given like major praise, because who knows how much longer she could have kept this going, or how much more money she could have taken from people, because people were like falling over themselves to give her money. And I think that is a huge part of why she was able to do this as well, because when you have that selling gene, it's, you know, some people look at it and they say, oh my gosh, I can't believe some people could raise that amount of money. But I am someone who, listen, I'm not confident about a lot of things when it comes to myself, but I know there's one thing that I can do, and that's sell. And my dad's very much that way too. He's very good at selling, and there is a lot of fake it till you make it going on. And, you know, a lot of these tech companies like Oracle pushed out really buggy software, and there's loads of situations like that where you can do that with tech, but you cannot do that with people's lives and their health. and that was also her detriment too. So I think that she was a really good seller, and I say selling, but you're mostly selling yourself. And even when you see the people speaking who invested in her, and there's still people who are on her side even after all this has come out. Like she's really really smart. Like you can't take that away from her, and she really has sort of a magic about selling herself and her ideas. And some of the quotes that are about her, like, oh, I knew I was looking into the eyes of the next Bill Gates or Steve Jobs, like they're pretty crazy. And what's really interesting is if she hadn't chosen healthcare, if she'd picked something else like tech based, like would she have been successful? Because obviously she could have sold the idea and got the money, and like she did set up the company and everything like that. So would she have been successful in a different way, or was she always cutting corners and doing things that would cause her demise? The other thing that I think really kind of helped her out and added to her cause is that people like her, like she grew up in privilege, she went to private school, she went to a very good university, and she had like a confidence about her too. But as I said in the beginning, she was surrounded by people who had access to a lot of money. And so, someone who's starting out on their own, who comes from low income, like even getting a meeting, even getting their foot in the door puts so many barriers in front of them in the beginning. Whereas she already had her foot in the door. She was already at the dinner table with these people. So that did give her kind of the insider track that way. And people who operate like in the very normal world, who have a 9 to 5 and they make a salary and they're guaranteed it every month, and they have their healthcare and they have their family and their kids and their car and their house, like these people who live in this like Silicon Valley or even just upper class world 1% lifestyle, like they make a lot of money, but they also spend a lot of money, and they live in this very like high paced, always on go. And when they're bringing in whatever they're bringing in, the hundreds of thousands of dollars a month, but they're spending that too, like people have this impression that everyone operates in this ethical way and everyone says who they are, and they have this impression that people like follow the rules and companies do, and it's just there's a lot more faking it until you make it than I think a lot of people realize. So I think that helped her out too, that she was a huge fraud, but there's a lot of fraud going on in the world. And one of the guys in the documentary said something really interesting, that he was talking about, lies and liars and lie detectors. And he was saying, he's a behavioral analyst, and he said, if you hooked Elizabeth Holmes up to a lie detector and asked her, did she think she was doing something wrong and was she scamming people, she would say no. And the lie detector probably wouldn't detect anything. And he was saying he doesn't think she lies awake at night and thinks, oh, I was scamming people, because she thinks, I mean, obviously this is speculation, that she was doing all this for the greater good. Like she thought that it was going to work at some stage, because I don't even think that she had sort of the medical knowledge to know this is impossible, and you need to have some scientific advance, like hundreds of years, even then probably not possible, to make this happen. There's a reason that this isn't happening now. Like, do you not think Quest and LabCorp, who their industry is worth around $350 billion, that these people wouldn't have figured this out if it was like faster, cheaper, more efficient to do it this way. I just really would love to know what is going on in her head when, you know, she's thinking about being on trial for the fraud. Like, does she deep down know that she is a fraud? Or does she truly believe her own lies? And sometimes some of the best liars do. I mean, the other thing is, like I said briefly, there are some people who are still loyal to her and still believe her. Most of the people who, even after the article came out, there was still people, like, they went after the reporter when he first published, and they were like basically saying, why are you destroying our company? And it works. And they sent like David Boyce and all these other lawyers in to like attack him. So thankfully a lot of the people have come around and realized like it was all a fraud, but there's still some people that are loyal to her. And truly, like, one of the most bizarre things too is she's a little bit older than me, so she's like 36 I think now, and she just got married to Billy Evans, who he's a little bit younger, he's 27, so take that as you will. And he is actually the heir to a hotel chain, so, you know, she is definitely not hurting. For a while she disappeared, and then it was found out that she was living in San Francisco, and obviously, like I said, she is pregnant. Well, apparently, you know, I'm sure she had to prove it for them to push the trial back, but like, would you believe anything this woman says? So she's supposed to be due, I think, in June, and then August, the very end of August, they're supposed to be starting her trial. So I'm sure this will all be brought up in the media again when the trial's ongoing and when the eventual result comes out. I mean, they are facing, Sunny's trial is going to be after Elizabeth's, and they are both facing up to 20 years in prison. So white collar, famously not a huge amount of prison sentences, and if they do even get one, it's usually, you know, very, very light sentence. And also, will her being a woman and a new mother and things, how will that affect her sentencing? So, I mean, I really hope that you guys enjoyed this episode, because Elizabeth Holmes and Theranos is so interesting to me. As I said, I'd seen the documentary a long time ago, and when I started this podcast, you know, I wanted to just talk about interesting women. And when I say Nice Ladies podcast, I'm using that, you know, kind of in a sarcastic way, because nice lady or nice woman, I feel a lot of the time can be used against women. So they're not all going to be quote unquote nice ladies, and I'm using it more in like a poking fun kind of way. So Elizabeth Holmes, I think the verdict is that she is not such a nice lady, because the amount of fraud that was going on. I mean, thankfully, a lot of the people's money that she took, they are people that they're not going to miss that money. Like, they're extremely rich. But there are a few people who did invest, you know, a lot of money, and it was their retirement or things. So those people, my heart really goes out to them, because, you know, like, the company is no more. But I think the most serious thing is obviously people got these test results. Like, there's stories there's a really good podcast too called The Dropout. It's on Apple as well. And then, as I said, the book Bad Blood is really, really good. And they talk a lot about these people who they ended up in the emergency room because the results came through so wrong that they looked like they were having a heart attack or they were having a stroke. And so their doctors sent them to the emergency room, and one woman had like $120,000 worth of tests, and Theranos's results were wrong. There was nothing wrong with her. So there's people out there too, like there's cancer patients that these tests were done on, there's children. Like, it's so unethical what she was doing, and it was her company. She was the CEO, the founder, and also had the controlling shares. So she was involved with every single aspect of everything too. Like in the documentary, the HBO documentary, there's so much footage of her walking around and holding up drops of blood without eyewear on, and just like they're in the lab, and there's, you know, so even just a split second of the video, it's like you can see about 15 things, that rules that they're breaking, and it just, but all she cared about was marketing and how everything looked, and talking about the names for things and the color to use. And fair point, the marketing was very good, but at the end of the day, no matter how good the marketing is, I hate to tell you this, Elizabeth, but you need to make sure the product and the device actually work, because all the marketing in the world isn't going to save you. And that is our episode today, guys. I really hope you enjoyed it. I really enjoyed talking about Elizabeth Holmes and Theranos. As I said, I'm sure there will be, you know, some more stuff coming out in the middle of the year, towards the end of the summer, when the trial gets gearing up and when it actually happens this time. So maybe I'll do an update episode if, you know, things get interesting with the trial. And make sure that if you guys are not subscribed to the podcast, make sure to subscribe, so that whenever I post a new episode, that you are notified and you get to listen to that week's nice lady, or not so nice lady in this case. Also, if you are watching this on YouTube, make sure to subscribe to my channel there and like the video if you can. Also, if you're on Apple or Spotify and you did enjoy the episode and you want to give me a little review, it would really help me out. So thank you so much in advance to anyone who does that. And also, don't forget to follow me on social media. I'll put all my socials in the episode description and in the drop down for YouTube. If you ever want to chat with me live, I do a live on YouTube at 7 p.m. UK time, 2 p.m. Eastern, and 11 a.m. Pacific on my YouTube channel on Fridays. So you can come and chat to us over there on Friday night. And if you ever feel like supporting the channel, I've also linked to my merch store. I've got some nice pieces of merch, and also featuring my extremely cute little cat. So treat yourself to some merch over there. As always, guys, thank you so much for listening to the Nice Ladies podcast. I really appreciate everyone who has listened to the episode so far. Episode 3 is going to be posted next week, and it's going to be an interesting one as well. So thank you so much, guys. Make sure to take care of yourselves, stay safe, and I'll see you in the next episode. Bye, guys.